Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, August 13th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the past 3 weeks of Donald Trump's 2024 campaign, as the New York Times dubs it the worst 3 weeks of Donald Trump's presidential campaign. What we know from this article are a lot of different pieces of information that have been compiled into a general summary, understanding how Donald Trump's candidacy has gone from being a very high favorite in the political betting markets, in polls, amongst pundits, whoever you were asking, to ultimately in a position where Kamala Harris has now taken the advantage by practically every single metric point since the past 3 weeks have transpired. And what I want you to look at specifically before we get into this is the political betting markets around the time that these past 3 weeks have started, really the past month. When the assassination attempt occurred, Donald Trump's odds at winning the presidency skyrocketed to 72% on the political betting markets. Today, that has dropped to 46%. It was Donald Trump's highest point in time that we've ever seen, 2016 and 2020 included, and it was a really strong showing for the former president. And he was on track for months on end of being in a really strong position to win the presidency of the United States. So now today, being at one of his lowest points of the campaign season. And so the New York Times has compiled a lot of information that I want to go through line by line practically, highlighting some of the most important moments that really help us understand exactly what went wrong this cycle and how Donald Trump is really in a position that is far worse off from where he was before. So let's go ahead and get into it as we get through this very long-winded article and talk a bit about the 2024 election, where he's most electable, where Kamala Harris is most electable, and what we're seeing in recent news and why that might be contributing to this overall downward spiral of the Donald Trump campaign. And so as their major headline here, beyond the worst 3 weeks, they talk about how President Trump has been this candidate who has now been knocked off his bearings. Essentially, they're calling him disoriented now that he's up in a new contest against Kamala Harris, the incumbent vice president who has replaced Joe Biden on the presidential ticket for the Democratic Party. And they go through a number of different things, but they start off around week 1 of this time frame, where they've dived directly into the immediate aftermath of the RNC, of J.D. Vance. But what I want to focus on here is a bit about Donald Trump's personal relationships. And that's going to be a more prevalent issue throughout this entire article, is that Donald Trump's erratic behavior and the way he interacts with voters, the way he interacts with the press, the way he interacts with donors, the way he interacts with his own campaign team might actually be the reason he loses the election beyond any other factor. Donald Trump, of course, is unpopular, but in many ways, so was Joe Biden and Kamala Harris at a period of time. But the fact is, she's now improving and rebounding in a very tight ship type of campaign, one that we aren't seeing on the Donald Trump side. And so they first start off this article by diving deep into an August 2nd dinner that was taking place in New York. It was a dinner that was meant for many wealthy donors, and it showed a bit of the interactions of Donald Trump with those who were his closest confidants, people who have been spending millions of dollars on this race. And they found here that the expectation when Donald Trump came into this dinner, this was roughly a week before the publication of this article, August 2nd, was that Donald Trump would signal that he was recalibrating after a series of damaging mistakes. And they soon found that through that dinner, he had no remorse and he had no intention of changing course from where he was. And these donors knew it. They were spending, again, millions of dollars on a race that we're suddenly now seeing Kamala Harris skyrocket in the polls, winning battleground states, winning nationally, winning on everything, from vibes to fundraising to volunteer signups to betting markets to whatever it might be. Again, every single metric has now pointed to Kamala Harris doing far better than Joe Biden, and these donors knew it. And so they started to talk to him about issues that they would hope that he would have changed his opinion on ahead of the election 100 days out. Things like the 2020 election, where he reiterated that the 2020 election was stolen. It was a shock to some supporters because they believed, although they may have agreed with him, that this was not a winning issue, that 2022 showed it, that even off-cycle elections, special elections proved that voters weren't in for this election fraud claim that Donald Trump had put on since 2020, and less than a third of America genuinely believes that the 2020 election was completely stolen by the Democratic Party. And so they knew this was something that Donald Trump needed to change, and almost immediately they knew that he had not. They also had hoped that after the National Association of Black Journalists conference, where Donald Trump spoke at and was grilled by the reporters there, in which he had no positive responses, not a single piece of positive coverage in the aftermath of that event, where he questioned Vice President Kamala Harris's racial identity. We saw here that many of the donors also were hoping that he would change his mind on that he would go ahead and walk back some of these comments, but instead he doubled down, saying he, quotes, thinks he was right, which rattled donors on that Friday evening. And so the fundraiser really was at a point where he was trying to get even more money. From the point at which Joe Biden dropped out of the race up until August 2nd, everything had turned away from the Donald Trump campaign, including any coverage around Joe Biden dropping out. Why? Because he did. Any coverage around the assassination attempt. Why? Because now Kamala Harris is the presidential nominee. Any conversation around J.D. Vance and the RNC. Why? Because Democrats now have their own convention and a whole new set of Veep stakes. And so they found here that the media narrative was pulling away from him. Donald Trump was getting a little bit more extreme. And they were hoping that this fundraiser would reassure them that this candidacy was here to win. And unfortunately, it did not. And some of the donors also expressed that they had problems the way that he attacked people like Governor Brian Kemp, who is the governor of Georgia, a very popular one in 2022, and yet Donald Trump has been railing against him, calling him a rhino, saying that he's a bad governor, that he shouldn't be in that office. And that matters because voters in Georgia absolutely adore Brian Kemp. They do not adore Donald Trump. And so when you go after somebody that they like, especially those swing voters who voted for him but voted for Biden, they're much more likely to vote for Kamala Harris again. Donors are upset about this, voters as well. Again, speaks to an issue that only continues to explain why Donald Trump is in a worse position than where he was a month ago. And so largely speaking, they talk about how Kamala Harris has been long ridiculed, but far, far, far underestimated in terms of her performance, saying she has, quote, transformed the contest, campaigning energetically and drawing roughly even with Mr. Trump in many polls, and also finding that she's building out crowds, she's building out the framework, she's doing what needs to be done to win the election. Donald Trump is not. And they say Donald Trump has largely found this to be disorienting. They were up against an 81-year-old candidate who they believed had no mental ability to win this election. They thought that this election was going to be won. And when you see at the vibes of the RNC and what people were saying there, they believe now the race is nothing like how they felt on the day of the RNC that took place nearly a month ago today. And they also were thinking back at the RNC, the vibes there too, where that Joe Biden was losing this election, Donald Trump had already won, and the question was about the margin rather than whether he would win. Now, we're no longer in that circumstance. And so again, that recalibration on the Donald Trump side with this heavy hand of expectation that they were going to win this election no longer is the case. And that's a problem for the Trump campaign because that's why they chose J.D. Vance. That's why they chose Laura Trump to be the RNC chair. Ever since October of last year, the Trump campaign was adamant that they were going to win this race. When you look at how Donald Trump surrounds himself by family members, now Laura Trump running the Republican Party, Chris LaSavita, one of his closest advisors, who has been saying since last fall that this election was already won by Donald Trump, and so the question was about margin, not about whether he will win, goes to show that the campaign infrastructure was building on this idea that the pathway forward was undoubtedly an election victory. And what we know now is that may not be the case. And so now we're starting to see that Donald Trump is starting to go on the attack against Kamala Harris, even in private, getting very, very angry, referring to her as nasty, or referring to her as, a word typically used against women. It is something that you find that Donald Trump is really getting unhinged, and you're starting to see that the leaks are getting through the campaign. Close advisors are starting to go to the press, and I think a lot of this is because these close advisors don't dislike Donald Trump, but want a course correction. They want some type of public outcry. They want the donors to reach out and say, you need to stop this behavior, because they know it is losing behavior, and they know that if it continues, he loses this election. But the problem is that not only is he not listening to these donors, but recently he attacked a major fundraiser, Miriam Adelson, someone who had been donating a lot to the Donald Trump campaign and has slated $18 million in advertisements. $18 million in advertisements across 3 battleground states for Donald Trump, in which she had an aide text. Donald Trump himself had an aide text her many different things, but pretty much attacking her, saying that her organization was full of rhinos, that she was in a position where she was, pushing forth people in the RNC who, were not true Republicans, were not true pro-Trump candidates. And so that is really where the problem came in, and he attacked her. He went against her. This is someone spending $18 million on his candidacy, and he went after her. He went after her late husband. He went after her in many different ways, and it was a shock to her and her family. Why? Because they had a very positive conversation just a week prior at the RNC. And so you're starting to see that Donald Trump's behavior is the real problem in this at large. J.D. Vance also being someone that Donald Trump chose and believed would be the right candidate for the time. A lot of things are now getting under his skin, being called weird, deflecting to J.D. Vance, seeing that donors are now expressing concerns about J.D. Vance. He's talking to donors and saying that J.D. Vance is the right guy. I promise you, I made the right choice. So many different things here, and you're starting to see there's concerns about his behavior. Now there are concerns about his VP. Now there are concerns about the things he is saying, and it's starting to feel very reminiscent of the 2020 presidential election. And so beyond that too, I mean, we have seen that Donald Trump has really undergone practically a life story in the past 2 months. An assassination attempt, the selection of a running mate, the nomination convention, the withdrawal of his opponent, Joe Biden. So many different things taking place and really throwing him for a whiplash. And, to be fair, this is a position where Donald Trump probably didn't expect to be in, but at the same time, he is running for president of the United States, and fairly put, I think many Democrats could have foreseen that Joe Biden at some point was going to drop out of the race. I think Donald Trump's campaign probably could have foreseen this being a very real possibility. But beyond that point, Donald Trump has seen a whiplash of events, and he very clearly isn't handling it well. He also is seeing that his top pollster, Fabrizio, they do a lot of polls for Donald Trump. They're saying the polls are only going to get worse before they get better, but they don't know that it's going to get better. They're telling Donald Trump, just wait. It's going to be the announcement of the VP, then it wasn't. It's going to be you withdrawing from the debate, then it wasn't. Then it's going to be the DNC, and it might not be. And then it's going to be the first presidential debate, and then it might not be. And so they're pushing him out and saying, next week, you're going to see a rebound in the polls. And what we are seeing is a consistent trend upward in favor of Kamala Harris. And so, largely speaking, too, a fundamental problem of this campaign is now, with Kamala Harris on the ticket, they prepped for 3.5 years for a Biden-Harris ticket with most of the attacks on Joe Biden. 3.5 years of Sleepy Joe, 3.5 years of a campaign to push forth this idea that Joe Biden was not mentally fit to be president again. And in a way, they won, but not in the election that mattered, because Joe Biden withdrew from the race, and now all of a sudden the RNC was spending countless hours on opposition research or compiling opposition research that wasn't ready to go because she was not the presidential contender. And so they couldn't land on what to do. He tried to call her Laughing Kamala. He tried to go after her for calling her crooked. He tried to call her Crazy Kamala. He tried to do so many different things, and none of it is landing. It almost feels like he lost his energy. And obviously we know Donald Trump is still very much in this race. He's in it to try to win it, and he's in a position where he is here to do anything he can. But it is his campaign's inability to put together anything correctly, and that is the problem. He tries calling her fake. He's trying to do, or the advisors are saying, do that. Call her fake, saying she flip-flops. Go after her in the way George W. Bush did against John Kerry in 2004. But here's the problem. When he calls her fake, he does it in self-defeating ways, as perfectly described by the New York Times, questioning her racial identity, saying that she all of a sudden, quote, turned black. With some of the most offensive things said on a stage at the National Association of Black Journalists, where simply you should have been walking the line so incredibly finely, knowing you were not in an environment where you were going to be thrown softballs. You were not in an environment like Fox and Friends where you were calling in and get the ability to get things redone and said over. I mean, you are finding here that Donald Trump really messed up that response. And he is trying to build up on this, and he's doubling down. These self-defeating ways are happening all across the campaign. The way he attacks her, saying she's disrespectful to Black and Indian heritages. I mean, this is the way you lose a presidential campaign, leaning into racism, leaning into xenophobia, in a way that Donald Trump's campaign, many Democrats had said, was very much explicit. But on the presidential debate stage, and when he's talking about this to journalists, when he's talking about this in front of the press, it's going to get clipped, it's going to get put out there, and it's going to look very, very bad, and arguably rightfully so, right? When you're looking at some of these comments just from an objective point of view. And so, largely speaking, the final thing they mention here is that Donald Trump's own behavior remains one of the most unpredictable factors in this campaign. The main reason why we've seen the going in and out of the presidential debate, the going in and out of saying things correctly, going in and out of being all there for J.D. Vance or not, going all there and in and out of his, feelings about whether he's going to win the race or not, whether he was happy with donors or not, whether he's happy with the staff or not. Largely, Donald Trump is the common denominator here, who has been the driving factor in driving down his campaign's chances at victory. Donald Trump is the main reason he will lose this election. There was no real other reason. Yes, Kamala Harris is a far stronger candidate than Joe Biden. Yes, she has a lot of electability and has new news coming out of states like Arizona that show good results for the Kamala Harris campaign. But there is no one more that Republicans can blame if Donald Trump loses this election than Donald Trump himself. This behavior is not becoming of a candidate who can win this presidential election, not with all of these different factors on the line, not with the current state of the race. And so Donald Trump being in this erratic stance, being in this position where he just simply can't get off the ground after 3 weeks of constant attacks from the Democratic Party and momentum being built ahead of a period of time, the Democratic National Convention, that will only continue to build on where Democrats are, is a really bad look. And it comes at a time. Again, I know I've been saying this a lot, but it comes at a time where Donald Trump seriously needs to see some type of substantial rebound. Otherwise, the way that this momentum is going, otherwise, the way that these polling numbers are going, otherwise, the way that these fundraising numbers are going, otherwise, the way these betting market numbers are going, otherwise, the way the pundits are going, everything is turning in the tides for Kamala Harris, and it is just a matter of time before every pundit, before every mainstream analyst, before every poll, before every betting market shifts in favor of Kamala Harris, because over the past 3 weeks, these have truly been Donald Trump's worst 3 weeks of this presidential campaign, the worst 3 weeks we have seen since he launched in November of 2022. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.